Well, I'm joined now by Liberal MP Josh Frydenberg and Labor MP Ed Husic. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time this morning. There were more than a few people who criticised us in the press gallery during the Peter Slipper resignation saga for missing the point, for the fact that, in their eyes, Julia Gillard's speech on that day would carry a lot more resonance with the public. Well, that seems to certainly be the case in India, Josh Frydenberg.
Sure, no doubt it made good theatre, and I think one of the people there who were interviewed said it made great TV, but at the end of the day it was a distraction. These were false allegations of misogyny and sexism targeting Tony Abbott, and it was for base political purposes. You know, Margaret Thatcher, who turned 87 on Sunday, was once asked, "What's it like to be a female Prime Minister?" to which she quickly replied, "I don't know, I've never tried the alternative." And her point is, let's focus on policy. Whether you are a male or a female Prime Minister, let's focus on policy. And I actually think that Julia Gillard has spent too much time thinking about the Leader of the Opposition, despite her protests yesterday in Delhi. She spent too much time thinking about the Leader of the Opposition and not enough time thinking about real policy and how we can improve the economic conditions for all Australians.
Ed Husic, John Pilger also noticed the Prime Minister's speech this week. Writing in The Guardian, though, he says that she's no feminist hero, particularly when you look at the policies that she's brought in as Prime Minister.
Well, you know, cue up how many times John Pilger said something that a lot of people won't necessarily agree with, and it's probably we can rack that up as another, or notch that up as another instance of not agreeing with him. But I think the speech last week resonated, and obviously it resonated for a reason with a lot of women who feel that they have experienced that type of behaviour. I think these are touchstone moments where you do need to take stock of, as a community, where things are at, and I think we do need to take a few cues out of that. But I'm not going to sit here. It's too early in the morning to get served up the plate of what we just got served up from Josh about focused on policy, because I got to tell you, I mean, how you could trivialise...
Some of us have been up for quite a few hours, Ed.
Yeah, you and me both, my friend. But it has been certainly the case that we have here, this visit in India, a critical relationship between our two nations, where we're talking about a range of trade and strategic issues, and for it to be trivialised in the way it was a few moments ago does no good for Josh, and it certainly it is important for the relationship that we do emphasise the economic links between the two countries, the social links, and what can be done to, particularly in what we know as the Asian century, to basically create greater emphasis on an important relationship.
Josh Frydenberg, you mentioned there that the Prime Minister, in your eyes, has had too much focus on what the opposition leader has been doing. He's been, of course, in Jakarta. He met with the Indonesian President, SBY, which was quite an honour, but he didn't raise the most controversial element of the asylum seeker policy, the towback element. He did, according to reports this morning, raise the interception of asylum seeker vessels, but why not towbacks? Is he a mouse?
Well, David,
yeah,
this
Josh,
is a
David,
this is a furphy. In an important meeting between the President of Indonesia and the opposition leader of Australia, the issue of border protection was raised, and this is a key issue for the forthcoming election, because more than 26,000 people have come in an unauthorised manner by boat since Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard have been at the helm. It was agreed between the President and Tony Abbott that the details of those policy discussions would be followed up by their ministers and shadow ministers, namely Scott Morrison and Julie Bishop. And that's what happened. The specific issue of towback was raised by Scott Morrison, and Marty Natlegawa, the Indonesian Foreign Minister, has confirmed that was the case. So let's not get distracted here. A very serious and important meeting was held by the President with the next Prime Minister of Australia, and I think the fact that the Indonesians provided that meeting to Tony Abbott is a sign of how serious they take the relationship. And let me just say, and I'm happy to come back to India and talk about it.
Keep going, Josh. We'll take the rest of the program dancing around this.
But Ed, let's talk about details. When it comes to foreign policy, you guys have been asleep at the wheel.
Well, just before we do that, Josh, I do want to go back to the original question. Just the reason, though, that it wasn't raised by Tony Abbott. You pointed out that it was raised by Scott Morrison and Marty Natalegawa, but why not the leaders?
Because at the end of the day, these are details as part of the broader border protection discussion, which are followed up by ministers. That's how public diplomacy, that's how foreign policy is played out. And the fact is that the government has taken its eyes off the Indonesian relationship, whether it was the live animal exports issue or the border protection issue. And so the Indonesian president has given an opportunity for Tony Abbott to talk about a whole range of issues. And I'm sure not just border protection was discussed, a whole range of issues. They would have had a busy agenda to get through, and in that context they would have said, here are the details for Tony that are going to be followed up by a junior minister. So there's nothing surprising about this.
It's not that unusual, is it, for the leaders to talk about the broader picture and the ministers to pick up the detail, is it?
Wait up, two things. A few weeks ago we had Tony Abbott upbraid the Prime Minister while the Prime Minister was at the UN, saying that the most important thing to do is to be in Jakarta and trying to deal with this issue while it became evident that the Indonesian President was in the UN at the same time. And secondly, Tony Abbott has said this is the most important thing that needs to be discussed, that this was a preeminent issue which he said he would take up and then failed to do so. And on top of
he didn't fail to do so.
No, he did not. He did not raise it directly, Josh. He did not raise the turn back the boats policy that you guys talk about so much. And we also had in the last few days, David, suggestions that, and this is just Butterfingers diplomacy at its best, that the aid relationship would be raised as a reason as to why the Indonesians should accept a dangerous policy of turning back the boats. So we're not going to have a situation now where they beat their chest here and then they disappear into their own, roll into their own ball in Jakarta, failing to raise what they say is a huge issue to the Australian public.
Okay, well, there was also a pretty fiery session coming back home now in Senate estimates last night. In regards to a very different matter, of course, the Peter Slipper James Ashby case. Now, it's been revealed now that the government spent around $700,000 on legal fees, 17 lawyers in all, 3 of them employed pretty much full-time on the case. And that brought a fairly fiery confrontation in the Senate estimates hearing last night. Let's take a look.
Settled for $50,000, Mr Govey. I was involved in matters that settled for, well over $1 million, where it was me and perhaps a paralegal. I mean, that's extraordinary, Mr Govey, to expend that sort of money for a case that settles for $50,000. I've never heard of it in my whole 20 years involvement with the AGS.
I wouldn't want to give you the impression that these lawyers were all working in relation to the settlement of the matter for $50,000.
But Mr. Honestly,
there were a range of other matters.
Just let Mr. Govey finish, I think.
There were a range of related issues which they were involved in, and
Ed Husic, why did the government need 17 lawyers?
I think this is a ridiculous assertion that's been made by the opposition. There are 3 lawyers assigned to the case, and the others that were brought on an as-needs basis. But there were 3 principally assigned, and it is more example of. I mean, we have a matter here that's in the court, and we have this level of, well, basically the opposition favouring politics above process in this whole affair, where they have sought to effectively prejudge the outcome while the matter's midway through or in the final stages of consideration by the court. It is outrageous behaviour, and we saw the person who wants to be Attorney General in the form of Senator Brandis overstep his position a number of times last night, overstep the mark a number of times last night, and do things that are clearly inappropriate while the case is being managed. This by a person who wants to be the country's chief lawmaker.
Josh Frydenberg,
exactly right.
The government did say that spiralling legal costs were part of the reason that they settled this case with James Ashby. Isn't it reasonable that they did that rather than see these costs continue to go up?
Look, let's face it, Nicola Roxon has very badly handled this sexual harassment case brought by James Ashby. In the process, David, she has compromised the role of the Attorney-General as the first law officer of the Commonwealth and as a custodian of the courts. I mean, if Ed took some time to lift his head from reading his scripted notes, he would understand that the Attorney-General did comment extensively about this case while it was before the courts. She called it vexatious. She called the claim an abusive process. She refused to rein in Anthony Albanese when he equated it with Watergate. She refused to rein in Bob Carr when he said that James Ashby was more rehearsed than a kabuki actor. And then Nicola Roxon gave preferential treatment to Peter Slipper to enter the federal court through the judge's car park. This government has brutally and badly handled this case, and now we have revelations at Senate estimates last night that they have known about the details of these text messages since May of this year. Now, if they knew the details of those text messages since May of this year, they should have got Peter Slipper to resign a lot earlier, not wait for another 6 months before he was forced to resign. So I think, I think Ed and his colleagues have a lot to handle for here, a lot to answer for here. They've trivialised the issue of sexual harassment, and then they've pursued James Ashby for his sexual harassment case in a very base, partisan, political manner.
Wrong.
Ed Husic, just
wrong.
a quick response to that.
Well, I mean, back in June, the Commonwealth actually made an application that said it believed that it was, wrong, abusive process.
No,
we never... Peter
Slipper
sought to strike it out, Josh, but the Commonwealth believed it was an abusive process, and that this was, on that basis, the Attorney-General was within her rights to, in reflection of our position, to do that. You also said that the Attorney-General didn't call out Anthony Albanese. Wrong. Australian Agenda, she actually said a few months ago, that she wouldn't have used those words. So I think you're being quite wrong of talking of Nicola Roxon in that way to make your points. Check your facts, Josh.
OK, just a couple of minutes left. I want to move on. A report in Fairfax this morning that the government's budget update, the MyEFO as it's known, may be released as early as next week, possibly even Monday. Now, the Shadow Finance Minister, Andrew Robb's been quoted in this report as saying that this is clearly a snow job designed to disguise the full impact of the economic downturn. Ed Husic, why would MyEFO be a month earlier this year than it was last year?
Well, there are all sorts of rumours that circulate about what may or may not be affected by either budgets or MyEFO or when it might come out. The bottom line is when it's ready and it gets put out. The type of speculation that goes on around it more often than not is not sustained. But ultimately what we're trying to do is ensure that the budget surplus that we said we'd commit to would be delivered in the face of tough economic conditions elsewhere in the globe. But we've got a country that an economy that a lot of other countries would be jealous of or are jealous of: high growth, lower unemployment, lower inflation, low interest rates, and we're working to make sure we keep that the same way.
Josh Frydenberg, just very briefly, the downturn as it's being described will probably lead to even lower interest rates than they are now. That's a good thing, isn't it?
Sure. I think if interest rates come down, that can hopefully stimulate demand and ease some of the pressures in the housing market as well. But, I mean, no matter how hard Ed and his mates try to cook the books, they're not going to reach a budget surplus next year. Everybody knows that. It's a wafer-thin surplus at that, at $1.5 billion that they're projected, and they have $120 billion of unfunded promises. And we know that the last 4 budget deficits have totalled $170 billion. So we've seen drastic cuts to important areas like defence and to the Medicare chronic disease dental scheme and potentially to superannuation. This government's in free fall, and when it comes to the economy, they have no narrative whatsoever. They will not reach a budget surplus next year, and David, everybody knows that.
Josh Frydenberg, Ed Husic, we're out of time, but thanks for your company this morning. The US presidential race coming up right after this break.